stripped of her name in the convent at 12. A Lakota chief said it out loud and wed her. The morning I first saw her, she was standing at the edge of the agency road with a carpet bag that had lost one of its handles, and she was holding it by the strap that remained, like she was deciding whether to keep walking or turn back to wherever she had come from. Her dress was brown wool, mission cut, the kind they sewed on women who were supposed to become something other than what they were. She had black hair, loose to her shoulders. Her face was ours, Lakota, without question, and her eyes were moving over the camp and the lodges and the smoke and the horses with an expression I recognized before I could name it. Not fear. Something older than fear. The look of a person who has wanted a thing so long they cannot trust it when it stands in front of them. I had been chief of this band for 11 years by then. My father's band. His father's band before him. We were 53 people in that winter, and I was responsible for all of them, their meat, their disputes, their grief, their dignity in front of the agent who came every month to count us like livestock. 11 years of it. And I had done it the way my father did it, and his father before him. Without noise, without anger, where anger would cost more than it bought, without flinching when the agent talked to me the way a man talks to a child who hasn't learned the rules yet. I knew the rules. I simply did not always choose to follow them. That was my way. Quiet refusal, slow and steady, like water working a stone. I watched her from 30 yards off. She was looking at the camp, but she hadn't moved toward it. My cousin Chask came up beside me. He said, "In Lakota." She came off the eastbound wagon. Nobody with her. He paused. She has a piece of paper. I had a piece of paper once, too. The agent gave it to me when I signed something I should not have signed and was 34 years old and didn't understand yet how many things they would make me sign. The paper said I was the recognized leader of my band, which meant the government intended to deal with me and not with anyone else, which meant they had found the point of purchase for this group of people. I kept the paper. I used it back at them when I needed to. I walked over to where she was standing. She didn't startle. She turned and looked at me the way a person looks at something they have been told to expect, with a kind of controlled wariness that takes discipline to hold. She was younger than I'd thought from a distance. 23, maybe 24. But the way she stood was older. The convent does that. I didn't know yet that she had been in the convent. I knew it. The way you know a horse has been badly handled. Something in the stillness that isn't peace. I said, in Lakota, "You are looking at something like you are afraid it will disappear." She blinked. Her lips parted. Then she answered, in Lakota, and her Lakota was careful and halting, the way a person speaks a language they learned at home until they were 12, and then were forbidden to use for 11 years. She said, "I was told there is a camp here." "There is." "I was told." She stopped, swallowed. "I was told." "This is a Lakota camp." "It is." She looked past me at the lodges. At old Winona, hanging meat in front of her fire. At the children running. At my cousin Chask, watching us from 20 feet away with his arms folded, because that was what Chask did. She looked at all of it with that same expression, that old, bruised wanting, and then she looked back at me and said, with great care, as though the words might break something, "I am Lakota." I said, "I can see that," and something moved through her face that I will not try to describe because I don't have words for it even now, and I have had years to look for them. Her name was the first thing they took. She told me this later, the third day she was with us, sitting by my fire because my cousin's wife Winona had put her there and told her to eat. Her name, before the convent, was Zitkala, Red Bird. Her mother had given her that name because of the way she had come into the world fast and bright and crying, her mother said. Like the bird that comes ahead of spring. Zitkala. She had been Zitkala for 12 years. The Sisters of the Holy Name took her on a Tuesday in October. Her mother had been told it was a school, education, letters, and numbers. She would come home better prepared for the life in front of her, which was the life that was in front of all of them now, whether they chose it or not. Her mother, who was a practical woman, who had buried a husband and a son, and still managed to feed herself and this girl, had believed it. Or had half believed it, which was the same as believing it when the alternative was worse. The first thing the sisters did when Zitkala came through the door was give her a new name. Mary. They wrote it in a ledger. Mary. And then a number. Because there were other Marys. She told me the sister who wrote it had not looked up from the ledger when she did it. Had simply said, "Your name here is Mary," and made the mark, and turned to the next girl. Zitkala was gone. Just like that. A woman who had never met her mother wrote the name away in a book. She told me this without anger. That was the thing that caught me. No anger in the telling. Just a kind of flat, weathered recounting. The way a man describes an old injury that healed wrong. Not the acute pain anymore. Just the shape of the damage. The way the bone set. She said, "They told us names were vanity. That our old names were from a time that was finished." I asked her what she called herself in her head, all those years. She thought about it. She said, "I stopped having a name I used in my head. That was one of the things they did." She looked at the fire. "You stop calling yourself anything after a while. You just are. Without a name attached to it." I was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked. Out past the edge of the firelight, I could hear two of the boys arguing about something. And then a woman's voice settling it. And then quiet again. I said her name. Zitkala. Just that. She went very still. I said it again. Not loud. Not as a question. The way you say a name when you are returning something that belongs to a person. Zitkala. She didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. She was not a woman who cried easily. And she did not cry then. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose, and looked at the fire, and was still for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "No one has said that in 11 years. I said, "Then it needed saying." The trouble started 17 days after she arrived. I had known it would. I was not surprised by it. The only question was, which form it would take. And it took the form of a man named Corbin Dietz, who was the sub-agent's assistant, and who rode out to the camp on a Thursday morning with two men I didn't recognize, and a look on his face that said he had been sent to do something and was going to enjoy doing it. Dietz was not a bad man in the way that some of the agents were bad, not cruel for the pleasure of it, not reckless. He was bad the way a tool is bad. He did what he was pointed at. He had been pointed at this camp many times before. He knew me. He knew I didn't like him, though I had never said so. I didn't need to say things like that. He got down from his horse and walked over to where I was standing and said, in the particular tone he used when he wanted to seem official, "I'm told you have a woman here. Half-blood. Came off the eastbound wagon about 2 weeks back." I said, "I have many people here. That is what a camp is." He didn't appreciate that. He said, "This woman was placed by the mission board. She has a position in Yankton. A teaching position. She failed to report." He paused to let that land. "We are here to bring her back." I said, "You are not here to bring anyone anywhere." He blinked. The two men behind him shifted in their saddles. Dietz said, "Now, Sleeping Bear," which was what the agency called me. My assigned name. The name on his papers, not the name my father gave me. This isn't a matter for the camp. This is a legal matter. The woman has obligations. I said, "Her name is Zitkala. She is Lakota. She is here, in this camp, among her people. There is no legal matter." Dietz looked at me for a long moment. I could see him doing the calculation. He had done this calculation with me before, and it always came out the same way. I was the recognized leader of this band, the piece of paper said so. The agency, whatever its intentions, needed me to remain the recognized leader, because the alternative was disorder, and disorder cost money and time and paperwork that went all the way up to men in Washington who didn't want to receive it. I had learned how to use this. It was a narrow tool, but it held. He said, "The mission board will hear about this." I said, "Then, they will hear about it from me as well. I will write a letter. My English is very good." It was. He knew that. He got back on his horse. He looked at me one more time, and there was something in his look. Not respect. Exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that he had been stopped. That this was, for now, the end of the matter. He turned his horse, and his 2 men turned theirs, and they rode back the way they had come. I stood and watched them go until they were out of sight. Chosky came up beside me. He said, "In Lakota, he will come back." I said, "He will come back. And I will stop him again." I paused. "Go send a boy to Elktail's camp. Tell him what happened. He should know." Chask went. I stood there another moment in the road. Dust the horses had raised, and then I walked back to the camp. Zitkala had watched from between 2 lodges. She came out when the riders were gone, and she walked up to me with that controlled, careful walk she had, and she said, "You didn't let him take me." I said, "No." She said, "He will come back. He will." She looked in the direction the riders had gone. The road was empty. She said, "Why did you do that? You don't know me. I've been here 17 days. You have your people to consider." I said, "You are my people." She looked at me then, not sideways, not at the ground, directly at me, the way she didn't often look at people, the way I had noticed she tended to hold her gaze at an angle like she was protecting something. She looked at me direct, and she held it, and I held it back. She said quietly, "He called you Sleeping Bear." I said, "That is the name the agency gave me. What is your real name?" It was the first time she'd asked me anything about myself. In 17 days, she had been careful and quiet and useful and present, but she had not asked. She asked now. I said, "Tatanka Mani, Walking Buffalo." My father gave me that name when I was 8 years old. The morning after I sat up all night with a sick foal and got it through to dawn. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "That is a good name." I said, "Yes, it is." The letter I wrote to the mission board took me 3 evenings. I have a fair hand, and my English is good, as I told Dietz. Better than he expected because I spent 4 years at the agency school when I was young, and I paid attention even to the things they did not intend me to learn. I wrote the letter in the careful, formal register that these men expected. Because there is a way to speak to a stone wall, and a way not to. And I had learned the difference the hard way. I stated that the woman they knew as Mary was a Lakota woman named Zitkala, who had come home to her people, and that she had the right to remain where she was. I stated that her presence in this camp was not a matter of obligation or evasion, but of belonging. I stated, and this is the part I wrote, and then wrote again, until the words were right, that no institution had the authority to sever a person from their people, their language, and their name, and that to attempt to exercise such authority in this case would be a matter I intended to take up with every official above Dietz and above his supervisor, all the way to Washington if it went there, which I was prepared for it to do. I signed it Tatanka Mani, Chief. And then below that, in brackets, the agency name they knew, because I needed the letter read and not discarded. Elktail came the next day, from his camp 20 miles to the west. He sat with me and read the letter and made 2 small suggestions about the language, which were good suggestions, and I made the changes. He had been doing this kind of thing longer than I had. His band was larger. He knew Washington men by name, who knew him back. He said, before he left, "You are keeping her." I said, She is Lakota. This is a Lakota camp. There is nothing to keep. She is simply here. He gave me a long look. He had known me since I was a child. He had known my father. He said, "That is not the only reason, and we both know it." I didn't answer that. He smiled, which Elktail rarely did, and got on his horse and rode back west. It was Winona who said it first, out loud, which was Winona's way. She came to me the morning after Elktail's visit and said, without any preamble at all, "Marry her." I said, "You are my cousin's wife. You are not my mother." She said, "Your mother would say the same thing." That was probably true, I said. Winona said, "She stayed. She came here and she stayed, and she knows where the water is now and where the wood is, and she has mended 3 things without being asked, and she talks to the old women in her careful broken Lakota, and she listens hard when they answer. And her Lakota gets a little better every day. She stayed." Winona paused. Some people know where they belong from the first day. It just takes them some time to trust it. I said. She said, "Somebody has to." She went back to her work. I sat with what she'd said for 3 days. I am a man who sits with things. My father was the same way. He used to say you could hear more from a decision if you let it sit in the room with you for a while before you acted on it. I let it sit. What I found, when I looked at it clear, was this. I had been alone for a long time. My wife had died in the 3rd year of my chieftainship, fever, in January, and I had not looked for another because I was busy and because grief has a weight to it that you carry differently as the years go on, not lighter, just more familiar, and the familiar thing can masquerade as preference. I had been busy. I had not let myself want. I wanted. It was as simple as that, and as inconvenient as that. I was 41 years old, and a chief with 53 people's lives arranged around my decisions. And I wanted this woman who had been here 23 days, and was learning where the water was. I went to her on the 4th morning. She was splitting wood, which she'd taken to doing early, before most of the camp was up. She was not skilled at it. Not yet she held the axe too high, and the swing was off, but she worked at it steadily, which was how she worked at everything, with a kind of focused application that did not acknowledge that anything might be difficult. I watched her for a moment. She knew I was there. She didn't stop. I said, "Your swing is wrong," she said without turning. "I know." Choke down on the handle. She adjusted her grip. "And don't come down straight." She angled it. The next split was cleaner. She looked at it, then at me, and there was a flicker in her face, satisfaction, brief and controlled, the kind she allowed herself. I said, "I want to talk to you about something." She set the axe down. She turned. She looked at me in that direct way she had learned to do with me. Gradually, over the weeks, I said, "The trouble with the agency is not finished. Dietz will come back. The mission board will make more pressure. I can keep stopping it, but there is a thing that would make it harder to challenge." I paused. I was not a man who talked around what he meant, but I was finding this took more words than I had allotted for it. If you were my wife, formally, in the way they understand, with the paper, it would make the legal ground clearer. She looked at me for a long time without speaking. A horse stamped somewhere behind me. The fire smoke drifted. She said, "Is that the only reason?" "Try." I said, "No." She waited. I said, "I am 41 years old. I have been a chief since I was 30, and a widower since I was 33. And I have been careful and busy and responsible for a long time. I stopped. Started again. "You know where the water is. You are learning where the wood is. You say my name." She had begun saying my name, the real one, Tatankamani, in the past week. Carefully. getting the sound right. You are the only person in this camp who looks at me like she is trying to see all the way to what I actually am. Not what I carry. Not the office. Me. I was quiet for a moment. I don't have more words than that. I am not a man who has more words than that. She was quiet for a very long time. The axe handle was resting against her knee. The morning light was low and pale, and it was cold, and her breath made small white shapes in the air. She said, "When I was at the convent, I used to lie on my cot at night and try to remember my name. Just the sound of it. I was afraid I would forget it. I got where I could hear it in my mother's voice, the way she said it, Zitkala, like the word for bird and the word for red at the same time, like it had the color in it, and I held that. Just that. For 11 years that was the thing I held. I waited." She said, "You said it out loud. The third day I was here. You said it out loud, and no one had said it in 11 years. And I—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together and breathed. I knew then that I was not going to leave. She looked at me. She said, "I will be your wife, Tatanka Mani." Not a question. A statement, clear and decided, the way she did things. We married in 2 ways, because 2 ways were what the situation required. First, in the way of my people, which I will not describe in detail, because some things are not for outside ears, except to say that Winona wept, which she would deny to anyone who asked, and Elk Tail came the 20 miles to be there. And the camp ate well that night, and there was drumming, and the old women sang songs I had not heard since my childhood. Zitkala stood beside me in the firelight in a dress that Winona had worked on for 6 days, white duskin, and her hair was braided with shells. And she stood the way she always stood, straight and still, not performing anything, just present, just exactly there. The second marriage was in the agency office, 3 weeks later, in front of a justice of the peace who had ink on his collar and kept looking at his papers like he was looking for a reason this was irregular. I had brought the letter from Elktail, who had his Washington contacts, and the letter from a lawyer in Bismarck who owed Elktail a favor, and my own letter, and my own piece of paper, the one that said I was the recognized chief, and I put them all on the desk in front of the justice of the peace and waited. He looked at the papers. He looked at us. He signed, Zitkala, beside me. Did not let anything show on her face. But when the justice of the peace asked for her name to put in the record, she said, very clearly, without hesitation, Zitkala. He looked up. He said, "First name?" She said, "Zitkala. That is my name. All of it. Write it as it is." He wrote it. Dietz came back in the spring. I had known he would. He came with a new authority, a letter from the mission board with a formal seal. And he came with 3 men instead of 2. And he came with a longer speech prepared, which I let him deliver in full before I spoke. He finished. I said, "My wife is Lakota. Her name is Zitkala. She is the wife of the chief of this band. Here is the record of the marriage from the justice of the peace in this county." I gave him the paper. Here is a letter from a lawyer in Bismarck. I gave him that paper. Here is a letter from Senator Ward's office, which Elktail of the Western Band has arranged, asking that this matter be resolved without further interference. I gave him that paper. And here is a letter that I wrote myself, addressed to 3 different newspapers in the territory, which I have not yet sent but am prepared to send, detailing every interaction between this camp and the agency's office over the past 4 years, including the matter of the beef ration in February of 2 winters ago. Dietz looked at the papers in his hands. His jaw moved. I said, "The beef ration letter is the one I would be most careful about." He knew what I meant. The beef ration, in February of 2 winters ago, was a thing the agency very much did not want in a newspaper. He stood there another moment. Then he folded the papers and put them in his jacket and said, "I'll take this back." I said, "Please do." He left. I didn't think he would come back after that. He didn't. What I did not expect was what happened with Zitkala in the years that followed. I had married her, in part, to protect her. That was true, and I do not hide it. She was a woman who needed protection in that moment, from a specific threat. And I was the man positioned to provide it. And I provided it. That is what I do. That is what I have always done for the people in my care. What I did not expect was her. She learned the language back, completely, over the course of 2 years. Not the halting, careful Lakota she'd had when she arrived. Reaching for words through 11 years of rust, the real language, the full language. The one with all its registers and subtleties, and the way certain things are said only at certain times of year, and other things are said only by women, and other things are only said by men who are past 50 and have earned the right to say them. She learned all of it. She sat with the old women every day and listened and asked and listened again. And her Lakota grew back the way a tree grows back from a hard pruning faster than the first time, more deliberate. She began to teach the children. Not at a mission table with a slate and a switch outside, in the way things had always been taught. By doing and watching and telling. She taught the girls to tan hides, which she'd had to learn herself from Winona. She taught the younger boys the star names, which she'd had to get from Old Gaul, who was the one who remembered them all. She made herself a conduit for the things she had to reclaim, passing them on while she was still in the act of reclaiming them. I watched this, and I understood something about her that I don't think she fully understood about herself yet. She had not come to this camp simply to survive. She had come to rebuild. The convent had taken many things, and she was putting them back. One by one, painstaking and patient, and absolutely relentless. She did not announce this. She did not speak about it as a project. She just did it. Every day. With that focused application of hers that didn't acknowledge difficulty. She did something similar to me. I did not notice it was happening until it had already happened. I had been alone a long time. Not without people. I had 53 people, and then 61, when 2 families joined us from a broken band to the north, but alone in the way a man is alone, when there is no one who is particularly interested in what he thinks about when he is not doing the work of being a chief. No one who asks. No one who waits for the answer. Zitkala asked. She would sit beside me at the fire in the evenings and she would ask what I was thinking about. And then she would wait. Actually wait. Without filling the silence with her own answer. While I found the words, she was a good waiter. The convent had done that to her too. Probably. But whatever its intention, the result was this. She could be still and patient and genuinely attentive in a way that made it feel safe to say the thing you were thinking rather than the thing you were supposed to say. I started saying things I hadn't said in years. About my father. About the nature of the work I was doing. The constant management of pressure from outside, while trying to keep something intact inside. About my dead wife, which I had not talked about with anyone. Not because I was forbidden, but because there had been no one who wanted to hear it, who wasn't made uncomfortable by it. Zitkala was not made uncomfortable. She listened the way she did everything straight ahead. Nothing held back. She told me about the convent in more detail than she had in those first days. Not all at once. Over months. Small pieces. Offered carefully. The way you offer something breakable. The particular sister who had been kind to her for 2 years, and then transferred away and was replaced by one who was not. The girl she'd been closest to, a Ojibwe girl, named after a saint, who had run away in the night in the 2nd year, and was brought back bruised, and never talked about running again. The morning Zitkala had stood in the courtyard and tried to remember the sound of her mother's voice, and found that it was getting harder to hear. She told me these things and I received them. That is what I could do. I could receive them without flinching and without trying to fix them. Which were the 2 things she needed from me. I think. Because both were in short supply. One night she said, After a long quiet, I used to think I was broken. The things they took. I used to think those things were like parts of a pot. That once they were gone, they were gone. She looked at the fire. But I think they were more like language. You can lose the use of it, and then you can remember how. I said, yes. She said, you helped with that. I said, you did most of it yourself. She said, you said my name. And I said, she looked at me, then sideways at first, that protected angle, and then direct, all the way direct, the way she had gradually learned to look at me, and only me. The fire was low. The camp was quiet. Somewhere the horses shifted, and one of them snorted softly. She leaned against me, just that her shoulder against my arm, her weight steady and deliberate. Not a dramatic thing, not a performance. Just a person putting herself beside another person because that was where she had decided to be. I put my arm around her. We sat like that a long time without talking. The years after that have the texture of accumulated good days. I don't mean nothing went wrong, things went wrong, regularly. The way things always go wrong in a life. Hard winters and drought summers, and the agency's constant rotation of small pressures. A bad season when the buffalo were scarce, and I had to trade harder than I wanted to with men I didn't trust. The death of old Gall, who was the last person in the camp who had known my father as a young man, and whose passing left a specific silence I still notice. But there is a difference between a hard life and a bad one, and I had not always known the difference. I know it now. Zitkala and I had 2 sons. The first I named in the way of my people, on the 4th morning, and I gave him a name that meant something true about what I'd seen in the first days of his life. The second she named herself, and she gave him a name that meant returned, which I thought was right. She kept teaching. The camp grew not fast, but steadily, the way healthy things grow. Families came from other broken places and stayed. She was part of the reason. There is a thing a community has when it knows what it is, and she had worked at that, quietly, every day, without calling it what it was. I kept being the chief. I kept writing letters. I kept meeting with agents and sub-agents and men from Washington who came to count us and assess us and decide our future with the confidence of people who had never had their future decided by someone else. I kept using the narrow tools available and finding, sometimes, that they were enough. Not always, but sometimes. One evening, this was perhaps 6 years after she came to the camp, 6 years into being married. The boys were 5 and 3, and asleep in the lodge, she came and sat beside me and said, I want to tell you something. I said, tell me. She said, when I got off that wagon, I didn't know what I was going to find. I knew where the camp was because a woman at the mission told me, an old woman. Before she died, she whispered it to me. She said, go there. There is a chief there who will not let you be taken. And I thought, she paused. I thought I was coming to find a place to be, to exist somewhere without being erased. That was all I wanted. A place to be. She looked at me. She said, I didn't know I was going to find you. I didn't know there was going to be a you. I had stopped thinking there would be a you. She was quiet a moment. I want you to know that. That I know what you are. I know what it costs to be what you are. I see it. I didn't answer for a moment. I said, that is the most words you have ever said at once. She made a sound, not quite a laugh, but close. The kind of sound she made when something surprised her into almost laughing. She said, I meant all of them. I said. She was quiet. Then she said, do you know what it means to me? That you say my name? I said, what? She said, it means it is real. Every time. It means I am here, and I am this, and I have this name, and it is real. She looked at me. You kept making me real. We were outside the lodge. The night was cold and clear. The stars were out, the full spread of them, the ones old Gaul had taught her the names of, and she had taught the children. A horse was moving slowly somewhere at the edge of the camp. I took her hand. Her hand was warm. I held it. I said, "Zitkala." She said softly, "Tatanka. Mani." And that was all. That was enough. We sat under that sky until the cold drove us in.